Chapter 6.
I humbly beg your forgiveness. My behavior on the battlefield the other day was most inappropriate. I do not know what had come over me. Ferdinand, a dancer's role is a vital unit to any army and one that should be treated with the utmost professional respect. My uncouth reaction was beyond discourteous and deserving of full reprimand. Ferdinand, I fully accept any punishment you find suiting for me to pay reparations for my abhorrent behavior. Ferdinand, Yes? Hubert sighed and pressed a palm to his face. Dawn had barely broken the sky, and Ferdinand von Eyre stood in his bedchambers, picking at a thread on his tunic, and struggling to maintain eye contact with Hubert. They, as well as many other battalions of the Imperial Army, had returned to Garreg Mach from the Fargus border late the previous night. Although no stranger to exhaustion, Hubert had all but collapsed into his bed the moment he reached his private quarters. He had barely enough energy to change into his bedclothing. If it were up to Hubert, he would still be blissfully sleeping. Such would not be his fate, as he had been woken to the sound of soft, hesitant tapping at his door. The noise had been so quiet, Hubert had assumed it to be a mouse, as he had blinked away the clumps of sleep crust that clung to his lashes. When it had repeated seconds later, Hubert dragged himself out of his bed and towards the door, ready to stab or scream at whoever thought that unconsiderable time of morning was a good moment to seek Hubert's audience. The prepared snarl had died in his throat as he tore open the door and saw Ferdinand standing before him, fidgeting like a distractible toddler. Blotches of red had already started to paint his face, and the paladin's gaze kept flickering between Hubert and his feet. The two had been avoiding each other since the dancing incident. A polite distance had been maintained between them during the long trek back to Garreg Mach. Occasionally, one would catch the other's eye from a distance, before hastily looking away. Now, after days carefully evading one another, Ferdinand stood in the middle of Hubert's private quarters, flushed-faced, fidgeting non-stop, and looking as if he were about to burst into tears and start wailing for forgiveness, as he had done on the battlefield the other day. Normally, the idea of Ferdinand spontaneously showing up in his bedchambers, with most of the monastery asleep, and Hubert in a state of partial undress, would be a rather pleasant one. This was not what Hubert had in mind. Ferdinand, Hubert sighed heavily, massaging his right temple with his fingertips. You did not say or do anything to cause me offense. If it will make you more comfortable, we need not speak of the incident ever again. Hubert internally cringed as he thought of his own role in Ferdinand's current state of humiliated dismay. He still questioned what unique brand of insanity had possessed Hubert that night to behave in such an unseemly manner. Hubert had known full well they were in the middle of a battle, and yet, seeing the way Ferdinand's eyes had glazed with what was clearly lust, the way the man's face was filled with not only adoration, but carnal want, as Hubert twisted and swayed his body to the rhythm of the dancer magic swirling within him. Hubert had drank in that look like a man dying of thirst. He punctuated each of his movements with sharp thrusts of his hips or pelvis, carving more of Ferdinand's heated attention. The improvised dance moves had certainly not been part of the choreography Dorothea had imparted to him. Ferdinand's frown deepened at Hubert's words of assurance. As a general in the army, the soldiers looked to me as a paragon of proper behavior. To react in any such obscene way to a valued member of our military reflects poorly on the entire army. Punitive measures of some sort must be taken. Surely the way you have castrated yourself these last few days has been punishment enough. But Hubert, Ferdinand, it is fine. Hubert pinched the bridge of his nose and took a deep breath before continuing. It was a temporary moment of embarrassment, one that neither of us need not linger on. No one was harmed. Therefore, we should put the aforementioned incident to rest. Do not let this matter trouble you any further. Ferdinand let out the deep breath he had been holding. His shoulders sagged as the tension poured away from his body. "Thank you," he said, his frown shifting to a small smile. "I am relieved to hear you say that. I was afraid that this incident may have sullied your thoughts of me, and irrevocably damaged our friendship." The final word hit like a lance through the heart. Hubert tried not to visibly flinch. Friendship. Of course. Think nothing of it. Hubert barely managed to squeeze the words past the lump in his throat, without them deteriorating into scratchy, broken glass. The matter is past us, and we can carry on as before. The smile on Ferdinand's face slipped away once more, a veil of somberness creeping across his face, and darkening the paladin's usual light. Thank you for listening to me. I wanted to clear the air before I depart. I should go now. There is still much to prepare. Hubert blinked at Ferdinand's statement, as the paladin made his way to the door. Are you being redeployed already? He frowned. As far as Hubert knew, there were no recent movements on the Fargus or Leicester borders. Oh, no, nothing of the sort, Ferdinand piped in a shrill voice. His face twisted with an emotion Hubert could not quite pinpoint, a muddied swirl of grief, decorum, and strangled cheerfulness. Just a personal matter I need to attend to. I should be back within a week. I see. Hubert froze his face in a mask of careful neutrality. In that case, I wish you the best of luck during your short travels, and look forward to seeing you again when you return. Ferdinand lingered in the doorway. His fidgeting returned, his fingers tapping and picking at the doorframe he was holding on to. Distress poured over his face in heavy swaths that swallowed up the other emotions that had flitted through his visage. His mouth opened, as if to speak, but no words came. In the end, Ferdinand flashed a bright smile that appeared far too forced. Thank you, Hubert. I shall see you again soon. With a small bow, Ferdinand departed from Hubert's room, and made his way from the former Steuben dormitories. Hubert watched the man silently retreat to his own room. Sighing heavily, Hubert ducked back into his room, door shut behind him, and prepared for the day ahead. It was early afternoon. Hubert sat at the garden side table, normally occupied by Ferdinand and himself, when they had tea with one another. He sipped at his cup of coffee, while staring at one of the many battle reports that were stacked on the table. A small rock had been placed on the pile, to prevent the parchment from flying away in a flurry of scribbled documents whenever a breeze brushed past. Hubert hoped to have shared tea with Ferdinand that day. He had hardly seen or spoken to the other man since his mission in Leicester, and had been itching to hear how things had fared out east for the paladin. Like a cat basking in the rays of sunshine, Hubert would drink in Ferdinand's animated retelling of his Leicester endeavours. Even the most mundane of events, a serenade to Hubert's ears when shared by the vivacious Holy Knight. With both their hands resting on the table, Hubert's gloved fingers would twitch ever so closer to the paladin's, reaching for, but never working up the courage to touch or hold the hand of the other man. However, with Ferdinand's sudden departure, Hubert had found the space he had cleared in his morning schedule blank and gaping, a void that left Hubert with a hollowed-out sense of emptiness that the paperwork failed to smother. In the end, he had decided to brew himself some coffee and take his seat at the gardens as originally planned. The temperature that day was agreeable, and there were battle reports that needed to be examined anyway. None of the information in the documents was classified, largely consisting of provisions that were consumed and needed to be replenished, making it safe to review the reports in a public setting. Besides, he needed something to fill the time before his tutoring sessions with Sylvain began. Hubert reread the same sentence for the 10th time. He clutched his quill nearly tightly enough to snap the blasted thing. The list of provisions he was scribbling down was an illegible jumble that trailed off after item 5. A cheerful giggle from a nearby couple flittered from one of the rose beds. 2 young men were placing flowers in each other's hand and cooing at each other with nausea-induced sweetness. Hubert gnashed his teeth at the grating sound. He pushed away the urge to drop a puddle of mire on top of the rosebed and melt the colorful flowers into sludge. With Ferdinand's absence, he had planned to invite Lady Edelgard to tea instead. However, when he sought her out to extend the invitation to tea, he had quickly found her in the company of the professor over by the fishing pond. A rare bubble of carefree laughter had poured from his lady liege as she struggled to hold on to the quaking fishing rod as she reeled in her catch. Even the professor's normally unreadable visage had brightened into a near imperceptible smile as she offered advice in words of encouragement in her usual calm tone. Hubert had quietly departed, a small smile on his own face at the sight of his lady liege and her companion. He had debated extending an invitation to some of the other Black Eagle students, but decided against it. Anyone worth spending time with would likely pick up on his morose mood in seconds and begin fretting over him. Out of habit, he had brought the teapot with him. Immediately, he had cursed his absent-mindedness at bringing the unneeded item. Now the teapot, a nondescript but elegant-looking piece of black ceramic trimmed with silver paint, sat empty and unused on the table, as a monument to Hubert's sour mood. There was no reason to waste the tea supplies if no one was there to enjoy them. Hubert put down the parchment and quill. He sipped at his cup of coffee and tore into his cinnamon scone, as if the beverage and biscuit had personally offended him. It was not the same without Ferdinand's company. Without the holy night's glowing presence, the flowers and shrubs of the monastery gardens felt somehow duller, every bloom and leaf leached of color, the music of the songbirds nestling in the gardens muted and smothered. Even the freshly brewed coffee tasted stale on his lips. Hubert tossed the half-eaten scone into his saucer and scowled at the soldiers and monetary residents who were enjoying the sunshine and gardens, many of which were in sickeningly joyous pairs. Hubert glared at his documents as he continued to drink his coffee alone, though perhaps not alone for long, judging by the quick strides Sylvain was taking in Hubert's direction. The clanking of the paladin's armor had drawn his attention to the approaching Fargus knight. Each step clunked and rattled, like a hefty metal bucket bouncing down a stone walkway. He had nearly bowled over a cluster of priests in his haste to reach Hubert. The edges of Hubert's mouth quirked into a small smile as the knight reached the table. "Ah, Sylvain, I thought we were to meet in the library in 2 hours, though, if you have a moment to spare, and are partial towards coffee, you are welcome to join me. You're out of time." Hubert blinked at the blunt words, then smirked. "My, Sylvain, that almost sounded like a threat." Hubert chuckled. "Have you decided to show your true colors at last? Befriend the Imperial spy master so you may plunge a dagger into his back? I was unaware that a knight of Fargus was capable of such elaborate deception. I must say, I am impressed." Sylvain rolled his eyes far enough to nearly see into his own skull. Yeah, har, Mr. Morbid here with the never-ending gallows humor. No, seriously, you're out of time about Ferdinand." A beat passed before Hubert responded. "What?" Sylvain pulled out a chair from the table and took a seat opposite Hubert. Unease practically vibrated off the paladin in shock waves. The man's face twisted into a grimace. "Look, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Ferdinand's been receiving letters from some lady friend. It's been going on for months, apparently. And he's also taking several days' leave to visit her in Boramus." It was Hubert's turn to roll his eyes. Ferdinand is a kind soul who is friends with numerous people, likely from all corners of Fodland. It is hardly noteworthy that he would receive occasional correspondence from one of them. "Okay, then why go all the way to Boramus?" "Sylvain," Hubert shot him a withering look. "Tell me, where is Boramus located?" "In Ayr," Sylvain replied curtly, crossing his arms. "What's your point?" "And tell me this, what is Ferdinand's family name? Surely you must remember from the countless times he shouted it on the battlefield during our academy days." "Okay, so he likely grew up in Boramus. Still, not getting what point you're trying to make." Hubert took a deep breath to stifle the bubbles of frustration threatening to burst free. "Has it not crossed your mind that he is perhaps paying a visit to an old childhood friend?" Sylvain paused for a moment, his face pensive as he mulled over Hubert's words. "Sure. Okay. Well, you answer me this, smartass. You grew up in Adrestia. Does Ferdinand have any childhood friends? Aside from Constance, of course." Hubert opened his mouth to speak, but the words instantly died in his throat. No matter how much Hubert scoured his own mind, searching for names and faces of those who had spent time with Ferdinand during his youth, not a single one came to mind. In fact, aside from Constance, the only people that could be remotely considered childhood friends of Ferdinand were Hubert himself and Lady Edelgard. The taste of coffee in his mouth turned sour as he thought about how horribly he had treated Ferdinand when they were children. It was clear the young boy was lonely, and only wanted to befriend Hubert and Lady Edelgard. It had not been unusual to find Ferdinand toddling after them, moving his chubby legs as fast as they could carry him, and begging Hubert and Lady Edelgard to play knights and other children's games with him. Hubert had found Ferdinand's overexcitable and chatty nature an irritating distraction from his duties of watching over Lady Edelgard. He would humor the boy's clinginess for a short time, before looking for an excuse to be rid of his presence. Hubert's heart clenched when he thought about one particular incident where Ferdinand had shown up at his house with a small bouquet of clumped, hand-picked flowers. It was right after his ill-fated attempt to reach Lady Edelgard in Ferdinand. His father's soldiers had just captured and dragged him back to the manor. Apparently, Ferdinand had witnessed him being tackled to the ground by one of the Marquis's soldiers, and had shown up at the Vestre manor to check on Hubert's well-being. The heartfelt gesture was met with sneers and mockery. Ferdinand had been nothing but kind, but that had not stopped Hubert from redirecting every ounce of anger, frustration, and hatred at the young boy. Lady Edelgard being taken away from him had left him gutted, the ensuing emptiness filled with more pain and rage than his adolescent mind knew how to manage. His already festering hatred towards his father had turned into a volcano on the verge of erupting, and the trembling boy, with the earnest smile, was an easy target. Every word out of Hubert's mouth had been a serrated blade of malicious contempt, and verbal knives cutting with perfect precision, until the large, amber eyes had welled with tears. Hubert's mother had sternly, and rightfully so, scolded him for his abhorrent behavior towards the other boy. It had been the last time he had spoken to Ferdinand at any length before they began attending Garrick Mock together. With his guts knotted with shame, and guilt squeezing at his chest like a hawk's talons, Hubert remained silent in response to Sylvain's question about Ferdinand having any childhood friends. The edges of Sylvain's mouth quirked in smug triumph. "That's what I thought. Oh, and he said he was going to pick up some flowers once he reached Boramus." The mention of flowers made Hubert flinch. Images of a much younger, heartbroken Ferdinand, with his little handful of flowers, recoiling from Hubert's wrath as his act of kindness was greeted with hostile laughter and scorn. It was a wonder Ferdinand wanted anything to do with Hubert, given his horrendous behavior towards the other man during their youth. Hubert took a deep breath and shoved the memory away. "And tell me, Sylvain, where exactly did you come across such intel?" Hubert scowled at the paladin. He set aside his cup of coffee and crossed his arms. Sylvain leaned in close and dropped his voice to a loud whisper. "I was just coming back from a scouting mission, and I overheard Ferdinand talking with the gatekeeper as he was preparing to leave. Said he was looking forward to seeing her in person after months of communicating by letter." Hubert suppressed a grimace. The information Sylvain provided was vague at best, and could be interpreted in many ways. But then Hubert remembered Ferdinand's uneasiness that morning as he departed, the fidgeting and storm of emotions that swirled around the other man, how he had looked at Hubert, his face cragged with anguish as he fought to share a painful message with Hubert. Had he noticed Hubert's affections and was seeking the words to politely decline the Major's romantic overtures in light of a new courtship? Any clues as to the identity of the woman Ferdinand has been exchanging letters with? Hubert asked. His face twitched, a snarl threatening to break through the mask of cold neutrality. A part of him screamed to drop the matter. It was Ferdinand's personal business. He had no right to interfere with his companion's private life, especially any romantic developments that may be taking place. But then there was that other part of him, coiled and seething, like an irate serpent, hissing and bearing its venomous fangs at any approaching intruder. Who was this mystery woman who had managed to bewitch Ferdinand so easily? He gritted his teeth at the thought of Ferdinand and his unknown admirer linked arm in arm as they traversed the gardens, gazing into one another's eyes with moonstruck, maudlin affections, noxious giggles, and words of endearment coated with cloying, gluey sweetness thick enough to choke a passerby. No different than the other saccharine couples that currently infested the gardens with their obnoxious, blithesome fawning for one another that flayed Hubert's nerves into searing pulp. Hubert tried to shake the image away, insist that Sylvain had misinterpreted what he had overheard, but it had hooked its barbs into his skull and seeped its corroding poison across his mind. "Not really," Sylvain frowned and shook his head. "All I know is that Ferdinand's pen pal isn't one of the ladies from Garreg Mach." "And what makes you so certain?" Hubert frowned. "Perhaps they are meeting in a distant location to maintain a sense of privacy. As for the letters, our soldiers are often deployed to posts all across Fodland. The epistolary correspondence may have merely been a way for them to maintain contact while engaged in separate missions." As the word left his mouth, Hubert began scrambling through a list of potential suspects that he knew Ferdinand was close with. Lady Edelgard? No, Hubert would have surely heard something from either of them. Dorothea, perhaps. Ferdinand had expressed his admiration towards the songstress since their academy days. Then again, it had only been recently that Dorothea had been viewing the Holy Knight with anything other than contempt. Bernadetta? The two had been betrothed for a time. Perhaps they had decided to go through with their arranged marriage after all. The idea seemed unlikely, given Bernadetta was often quite skittish around Ferdinand, and he would never insist on marrying someone who was uncomfortable with him. Petra, maybe? Both had an interest in weaponry and exploring different combat styles. Had feelings between the two emerged from such common ground? Manuela? Ferdinand had gushed to Hubert many times about how much of an inspiration the former opera star had been to him during his youth. Had Ferdinand's fondness for the retired songstress pushed him to seek something deeper? No, it was only days earlier Manuela had been lamenting over how her most recent romantic entanglement had ended bitterly. Then there was Mercedes. Ferdinand had blundered his way deep into enemy territory, miraculously not getting caught, in order to obtain documents that revealed the duplicitous means her adoptive father employed to secure custody of her. What of Constance? She and Ferdinand were close childhood friends before the fall of House Nouvelle. Could something deeper have blossomed from the bond they held during their youth? Though there was nothing to suggest in either their actions or words that their companionship was anything but platonic. Then there was also Marianne. I can tell by that constipated look on your face that you're going through a mental list of every lady Ferdinand has interacted with here. Sylvain's sharp words cut through the congealed puddle Hubert's brain had melted into. I'm telling you, it's not someone at Garreg Mach. Hubert glared at the other man. And what makes you so certain, unless you are already aware of the identity of Ferdinand's supposed admirer, and care to divulge it with? A sudden thought slammed through Hubert's mind, and sent ricochets of dread through his body, as another potential subject blazed through his mind. Another individual with whom Ferdinand had spent many tea times, one with a most grating, ostentatious disposition, who often viewed Hubert as a bug he found crushed under his boot. An individual Hubert would have gladly disposed of long ago had the noble's presence not been essential to maintaining peace with Leicester. Are you certain the letters he received were from a woman? Hubert gritted. Just the thought of Ferdinand, turning his fond gestures and loving smile towards that bumptious, self-absorbed fop, made him ill. The ever-present urge to strangle the pompous Leicester noble soared to a crescendo. Sylvain stared at Hubert for a moment, before bursting into laughter. It's not Lawrence, if that's what you're worried about. Sylvain chuckled. The letter writer Ferdinand mentioned was definitely a woman. As for Ferdinand's lady friend being someone at Garreg Mach, I asked Yuri and the other wolves, and they have no clue who it could be. The Ashen Wolves know of this as well? Are you capable of maintaining confidentiality with any information you are given? Hubert growled. Hey, you know every rumor and scrap of gossip in Garreg Mach goes through those four. If they don't know who Ferdinand's secret admirer is, then it's definitely not someone here. Hubert opened his mouth to continue the inquiry, but felt the words dry up and die on his tongue. Deflated, he slumped against his chair and sighed as rational thought took control of his brain once more. If Ferdinand has found someone with which he intends to pursue courtship with, then that is his business, and his alone. I have no claim or right to his affections. Who he chooses to bestow his love upon is his decision. Sylvain's jaw dropped, and he stared wide-eyed at Hubert, as if the mage had just sprouted wings and a tail. Wait, so you're just going to give up? After everything? Sylvain shouted, incredulous. A surprising amount of anger had seeped across the paladin's face. If you are so concerned about your wager you owe Yuri, I can provide compensation for your loss, if that will end this pointless crusade of yours once and for all. Hubert muttered in a flat growl. He tried to glare at the other man, but found his usual scowl drained of its usual fervor, and reduced to a dried husk. His gaze drifted down, staring at his cup of lukewarm coffee. "This isn't about a damn bet!" Sylvain shouted, slamming his fist on the table and rattling the dishes. Hubert's eyes snapped at the outburst. "If you do not care about the money you owe the mockingbird, then why become so invested over whether or not Ferdinand and I become romantically involved with one another?" Hubert hissed, sparks of heat returning to his glare. Sylvain's face flared red, an unguarded sheepishness, an expression similar to a child who had been caught red-handed stealing pastries from a kitchen. Eyes wide, Sylvain's gaze drifted to the side as he scratched the back of his head, a gesture Hubert had noted the other man did when he was uncomfortable or embarrassed. "Look, call me a sap, but I really do think you and Ferdinand are perfect together, and so does nearly everyone who attended Garreg Mach. I mean, you absolutely light up around him. I've never seen you smile so much as you do when you're with Ferdinand. As for the golden boy, well, he's always a sunshine ball, but with you his happiness seems genuine, like he doesn't have to put on his usual happy-go-lucky everything's perfect performance. The two of you are made for each other, and you both have your heads so far up your own asses that neither of you can spit out the handful of words needed to confess your love for one another. It's frustrating as hell to watch." Hubert scrunched his shoulders in the same manner a bird would ruffle its feathers. His grip on the cooling coffee cup tight enough it felt as if the porcelain would shatter in his hands. "If the actions between Ferdinand and myself are such an irritant to view, then perhaps you, as well as a sizable amount of our army who clearly have too much time on their hands, should direct your attention towards a means of entertainment that is less likely to offend your childish need for a happily ever after ending." Hubert huffed, narrowing his eyes at the paladin. "There are plenty of operas and fairy tales that all of you can peruse to satiate your need for over-sentimental drivel. You can all stop projecting your inane fantasies onto Ferdinand and myself." Sylvain narrowed his own eyes, his glare matching the mage's. "This may be hard for you to believe, but some of us consider you a friend and, imagine this, actually care about you and want you to be happy," Sylvain growled. "And I don't know about you, but seeing one of my friends feel absolutely miserable really sucks." Hubert stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, and scrunched his nose. Listen. I gave you the information I have. What you plan to do with it is up to you." Sylvain sighed, and stood up from his chair. Frustration deflated into wariness, as he cast one last sad look at the mage as he departed. Hubert sat alone at the garden-side table, with only his cold cup of coffee and a stack of battle reports to keep him company. Every crackle of gravel rolling under the carriage's wheels was another needle jabbed into Hubert's skull. A dull ache had sunk into Hubert's jaw that radiated up to his ears and stirred awake another cluster of headaches. Multiple times he had to stop himself from grinding his teeth into dust. Hubert's fists clenched and unclenched on his lap. His right leg was crossed over the other, twitching and kicking at the air in cadence to the sour tension throwing along Hubert's nerves. He was only going to Baramas to ascertain that Ferdinand's friend was operating under the best of intentions. Ferdinand was a renowned general, a crest-bearer, and the heir to a notable Adrestian estate. He would be a prime target for swindlers looking to extort coin from a prominent noble through some sort of romance scam. As Her Majesty's spy master, it was essential for Hubert to look into any possible threats levied at one of Adrestia's high-ranking officials. Besides, the trip to Adrestia's eastern coast was not completely frivolous. There had been some leads concerning those who slither in the dark, coming from that region that he had been wanting to look into. If he just so happened to run into Ferdinand and his admirer during his travels, what harm could there be? He had originally hoped to settle the matter by simply speaking with the gatekeeper Ferdinand had supposedly been talking with. Unfortunately, that specific gatekeeper had left for Enbar to look after a sickly family member shortly after Ferdinand's own departure. There was no telling when the gatekeeper would return to Garrigmach, and Hubert found it unreasonable to track the man down in the capital over such a trivial issue. Before his departure, Hubert had left a note with a messenger to be passed on to Sylvain, saying that he would be unavailable for tutoring over the next few days. He did not bother with an explanation, realizing the paladin would likely see through any flimsy fabrication he concocted regarding his whereabouts. Images bounced in his mind of what Ferdinand's admirer was like. Was she outgoing, approachable and warm? Did her very presence make Ferdinand beam, and laughter dance across his lips? Hubert buried his face in hands and groaned as the carriage bounced along the roads. Eventually, they arrived in Boramas. Hubert stepped out of the carriage, handed the coachman his payment, and made his way into the coastal city. The taste of salt water clung in the air, carried on the warm breeze, sweeping up from the Pearl Sea. In the distance, he could see where the city sloped down to the harbor, and the numerous ships coming and going from its ports. Wagons filled to the brim with produce and other goods traversed the well-worn roads that led to the city harbor. The sun blazed down on Hubert. Already he could feel the sweat beading on his forehead and sticking to his curls. Knowing Eyre Territory's warm climate, Hubert had chosen to forego his typical cape and coat, electing to garb himself in a lightweight white tunic. Although it did not have Bridget's humidity, Boramas's air temperatures had the scorching intensity of an oven. Even the air smelled of heat, baked into a dry, earthy scent that tickled Hubert's nose. Although not as large as Enbar, Boramas was a lively city in itself. Nestled on the coast of southeast Eyre, the city was the beating heart of much of Adrestia's trade and commerce. Any goods imported from Almira, Morphis, and Leicester's eastern coast went through the port of Boramas, while Enbar was comparable to a sleek, polished diamond with its cobble roads and ornate architecture. Boramas had the rustic quality of aged bronze. The city was composed largely of stucco buildings and arches that were painted white, decorated with carved iron flourishes. Potted flowers hung from the buildings and dotted the streets in colorful splashes. Once Hubert arrived in Boramas, it did not take long to locate Ferdinand. The man was in the city marketplace, standing at a flower merchant's booth. Hubert cringed as he noticed Ferdinand already holding a fistful of very familiar, small, white flowers, yarrows, and more so when the vendor handed him a bouquet of sunflowers and large daisies. Ferdinand arranged the flowers he had already picked into the bundle, handed the vendor some coin, and departed with a word of thanks. Hubert kept his distance, pretending to be interested in some imported silks from an Almiran vendor. From the corner of his eye, he could see Ferdinand making his way up the street. Moving from booth to booth, feigning interest in the offered products with effortless courtesy, Hubert kept his target in his sight. Still, Ferdinand did not notice Hubert trailing him. A part of Hubert wanted to jump out of the shadows and berate the other man for letting himself be followed so easily. There was no sign of Ferdinand's admirer yet. The man walked alone with his bouquet of flowers, but his quick pace and sure steps made it clear he had a destination in mind. Eventually, Ferdinand passed through the tall iron gate and began to make his way across the grounds toward the large stone building on the other side. Upon the gate, there was a large sign carved with ostentatious, gold-plated lettering, "The Southern Eyre Boramas Sanatorium." Hubert frowned as he read the sign. Was the woman that Ferdinand was courting ill? Another thought itched at Hubert's mind, as his jaw clenched once more. It was possible that the admirer was only feigning illness, weaving a melodramatic story of tragedy as the admirer played the role in kind, a spirited young woman whose life was to be tragically cut short by illness, and sought their true love as their dying wish. Ferdinand was a gentle soul that seemed like the type to be swayed by a story of heart-wrenching sentimentality. Hubert bit back a snarl over the imagined admirer and scurried across the sanatorium grounds, once Ferdinand had entered the building. The acrid scent of healing tonics and poultices ambushed his nostrils with an intensity that made his eyes water the instant Hubert stepped inside. Dizzying, sharp tendrils of energy from frequently cast healing spells vibrated unpleasantly against Hubert's veins, as if the magic residue were attempting to pluck at his blood vessels like the strings of a lute. He could practically taste the traces of lyre and vinegar that dried his mouth and hung in the air from scrubbing everything in the building within an inch of its life. In the lobby, a giant portrait of Saint Setline smiled down on them with matronly warmth, despite her youthful visage. The winged caduceus staff was clutched in one hand, while the glowing sigil of her crest glowed in the palm of her other hand. Priests and bishops, garbed in imperial red robes, drifted between rooms and down the hallways. Many carried bandages, poultices, and healing tonics with them. Others, with tomes and staves in hand, raced towards the wing of the sanatorium that appeared to be designated for critical wounds. 2 priests walked past Hubert, the fronts of their uniforms stained with blood, their faces drooped with grief. Past a flock of healers, Hubert spotted Ferdinand's bright copper hair. The paladin was moving down one of the adjoining hallways. Hubert glanced at the posted sign as he followed. The wing Ferdinand had entered was a hospice, designated for those with terminal illnesses. An uneasy lump sat in Hubert's chest. He continued his pursuit. Near the end of the hall, Ferdinand gently knocked on a door to his right. With some muttered words Hubert was unable to hear from a distance, Ferdinand opened the door and ducked inside. Hubert kept his steps soft, but maintained a natural stride. The door to the room Ferdinand entered was still ajar. His throat constricted, and his chest tightened as if being crushed by a vice as he approached the room. Inside, he could hear Ferdinand speaking softly to another person. Taking a deep breath, Hubert peeked through the open door. The room was nondescript, as was often the case with most sanatorium patient rooms. A plain bed, covered in thick, cotton-white blankets, took up most of the space in the room. The bouquet Ferdinand had brought, already placed in a vase that sat on a bedside table. Ferdinand was kneeling at the bedside and speaking to the room's occupant in a low, soft voice. His body was blocking Hubert's view of the woman he was speaking with. Hubert slithered closer. His eyes narrowed as he peered into the room. The floor creaked under Hubert's foot. He cursed internally and tried to scramble away. "Hubert?" Ferdinand jumped to his feet and turned, gaping at the mage. "What are you doing here? Did something happen? Is the kingdom mounting an attack already?" Hubert opened his mouth several times, trying to force some coherent words past the garbled mess in his throat. He had expected Ferdinand to be offended that Hubert had stalked him halfway across the Drestia just to spy on him and his secret admirer. Instead, Ferdinand only seemed worried and confused by Hubert's presence. "I was merely—" "Is that Hubert von Vestra?" asked a woman's voice from behind Ferdinand. The words were shaky, almost brittle, but spoken with the utmost kindness. Hubert's eyes widened even further, not only at being directly addressed, but at the familiarity of the voice that spoke to him. It was not a voice he had heard recently, but the echoes of it clung to some of his distant childhood memories. Ferdinand stepped aside as Hubert entered the room. Laying on the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s to mid-50s, though her exact age was difficult to determine beneath the dark circles that nearly swallowed her eyes and the haggard lines that hollowed her face. Her sallow skin had an ashy hue, but the faint smattering of freckles could be seen sweeping across her face. Strands of lanky, dry hair that had clearly been a vibrant ginger at one point, flowed across her shoulders. At first glance, there would appear to be little in common between the sickly, frail woman in the sanatorium bed and the vibrant young man beside her. But the woman's smile, bright, radiant, and warm like the sun, was a mirror image to Ferdinand's. "I have not seen you since you were a child," Ferdinand's mother beamed, her voice coming in short rasps. "You have grown into quite the handsome young man." "Lady Penelope," Hubert greeted with a deep bow. Heat burned at his face, and shame roiled in his stomach. "1,000 apologies for my intrusion. I came here to Baramas on business of my own, but saw Ferdinand enter the sanatorium, and was concerned as to his well-being. I thought he was seeking medical aid for himself. I was unaware he was visiting with family. Please forgive my discourteous interruption." As far as lies went, this one was absolutely pitiful. First, it relied on the assumption that Hubert had somehow not seen the large bouquet of bright flowers the knight carried around, not to mention the fact that Hubert just happened to be in Baramas for business the exact same time Ferdinand was in the city, involved a level of contrivance that even a toddler would raise an eyebrow at. Penelope only continued to smile at her extra guest. Hubert's chest felt heavy at her gesture, as if his sand were slowly filling with sand. His stomach bubbled with guilt as he thought about the reason why he had followed Ferdinand into the sanatorium to begin with. "There is no need to apologize," Penelope rasped. "He has written about you often in his letters. I thank you for looking out for my son. It warms my heart to see how close the two of you have grown these past months." Hubert internally winced at the praise. The sand in his chest turned into a boulder, his stomach pantomiming the movements of an acrobat as he fought back the urge to throw up. He had no right to be there, barging in on a grieving son, looking after his dying mother. Hubert had done many things in his life that could be branded as monstrous, many of which that were objectively worse than this current predicament, but invading Ferdinand's privacy during such a vulnerable moment left a foul taste in his mouth that he had not encountered in some time. He should have never come to Baramas in the first place. Nothing but juvenile envy had fueled his thoughtless trip to the coastal city. Ferdinand had taken a seat on the edge of Penelope's bed. His mother's pale, withered hand was clasped in his own. Occasionally, his gaze would flick to Hubert, but immediately dart away when the mage spotted him. Glistening, amber eyes blinked repeatedly as he watched his mother. With shaky arms, Penelope attempted to push herself up into a seated position. Her muscles had atrophied, her arms brittle like dry sticks that shook and threatened to snap as she tried to maneuver herself upright. Ferdinand's brow pinched with worry, and he immediately reached over to her. "Mother, please, let me help you." She politely waved him away with another smile and a weak chuckle. "You worry too much, my sunshine. I can manage this," she assured her son, and began shuffling into position once more. Ferdinand opened his mouth to protest, but ultimately dropped his hands and honored the request. He chewed at his bottom lip and clenched his fingers, the furrow in his brow deepening. A wet droplet sprang from the corner of his eye and slid down his cheek. It took 2 tries for Penelope to successfully prop herself upright. Her arms moved with agonizing slowness. Even emaciated as she was, her arms shook and strained under her own weight. Hubert had taken a half-step forward to offer his own assistance, only to be stopped in his tracks by a sharp look from Lady Eyre. Once she successfully arranged herself into a seated position, Penelope offered the 2 men a shaky smile. Her chest heaved from the exertion, and rattled a hoarse cough loose. Ferdinand reached forward and arranged the pillows so that they were propped comfortably against his mother's back. He tucked the blankets around her lap, and returned to his seated position at the edge of the bed. The tear that had dampened his face had been hastily wiped away. Penelope's soft gaze turned to Hubert once more. "You look so much like Eileen," she smiled. "How fares your mother? I am still receiving her letters. Every single one is a delightful puzzle to solve." Hubert's lips quirked into a small smile at the comment. His mother did not correspond with many people in order to maintain her cover. The few times she did send letters, Hubert and Lady Penelope were among the few recipients. They were all written in an elaborate code, a cipher she eventually passed on to her son, that Hubert still occasionally used. "She is doing well. She will be happy to hear that you are enjoying her correspondence. I will pass on your well wishes next I see her." Penelope beamed and nodded at the comment, her illness-induced pallor a touch brighter. Hubert's gaze drifted to Ferdinand. The paladin had been uncharacteristically silent during the exchange. The hooks in Hubert's heart pulled as he looked at the other man. Ferdinand's gaze was fixed on his mother, her hand held in his once again. More wet trails had worked their way down the gentle slope of Ferdinand's cheekbone. "I should depart, and allow you to some privacy. I imagine there is much for you to discuss." Hubert bowed to the ire mother and son. The lumps in his chest and throat pulsed as he sought to make his escape. "Hubert?" Ferdinand's voice halted him at the doorway. Hubert swallowed and turned to the other man. Ferdinand was still seated at the bed, his gaze still largely fixed on his mother, but he watched Hubert from the corner of his eye. "Would you mind waiting for me?" asked Ferdinand. His voice was firm, but Hubert could see the slight tremor sweeping across his shoulders. "Of course," Hubert responded in an unsteady tone, his stomach and chest twisting into a rope-work of knots. "I will be in the gardens just outside." "It was lovely to see you again, Hubert," Penelope called out to him with that familiar smile. "The honor is mine, Lady Penelope." Hubert returned the smile and bowed. "I wish you well." As Hubert left, softly shutting the door behind him, he could hear the hushed whispers of Ferdinand and his mother speaking to each other fill the air. Silently, Hubert made his way out of the building and towards the sanatorium grounds. Every step across the marble floor thundered in his ears. His heart throbbed in his chest, and his mouth was dry. As he passed the main lobby, the eyes of Saint Sethlene looked down at him from her portrait with condemnation. Irrationally, he ducks his head to avoid her hostile gaze. Outside, Hubert took a seat on a bench placed near a bed of soft purple sea lavender. He sagged against the seat of carved rock and buried his face in his hands. A heavy sigh heaved from his chest that did nothing to untangle the knots and hooks that had latched to his insides and threatened to rip them out. Hubert was the head of the Imperial Spy Network, renowned for his intel and his ability to parse out the truth by any means necessary. Hubert was the one others went to when their information was lacking and secrets needed to be unearthed. And he had hurled himself after an infantile rumor with the absent-mindedness of an untrained canine chasing a squirrel. His mother! He was visiting his mother, you witless imbecile! Insects, drawn by the many flowers in the sanatorium gardens, flitted and buzzed around Hubert's head as the sun baked down on him. He could feel the skin of his nose burning a deep red. Sweat had soaked into the collar of his tunic, not of all which had been induced by the region's intense heat. Hubert tugged at the collar and undid the top two buttons, but the sensation of his throat being squeezed remained. Hubert had overstepped a personal boundary with the blundering disregard of a rampaging bear tearing through a camp in search of food, all over a rumor that did not even begin to approach the most basic definition of credibility. If Ferdinand wanted to lambaste Hubert for invading his privacy, then that was the paladin's right. Hubert gritted his teeth and tugged at fistfuls of his own hair as his brain circled over and over again how he ended up in this mess. His first instinct was to hunt down Sylvain and verbally, and perhaps literally, skin the paladin for igniting such lunacy to begin with. Hubert sighed. The thought rang hollow and fizzled away nearly as quickly as it had been formed. Blaming the Fargus paladin was far too easy. Hubert was the one skilled in espionage. He should have taken the time to investigate the offered information more carefully. His upper body slumped forwards until he was nearly bent in half, his forearms resting on his knees, and his head hung. Nearly an hour had passed by based on the movement from the sun. At last, Ferdinand emerged from the building and made his way towards the mage. Hubert jumped to his feet as Ferdinand neared him. "Ferdinand, I do wish to apologize again. I misconstrued some intel I had received regarding your whereabouts and—" Suddenly, Hubert found himself cut off as he was nearly bowled over by Ferdinand's crushing embrace. The paladin clung to Hubert, his face buried in the mage's chest, his whole body quaking. "Ferdinand?" A thick sob was the only response from the other man, Ferdinand's arms tightening around Hubert, his grip strong enough to leave bruises and dig into his bones. Hubert remained frozen, his limbs heavy like lead, yet refusing to move, as if they were filled with gelatinous sludge. The barbs that had hooked into his chest burrowed their way deeper, threatening to tear open a gaping hole that exposed his racing heart. The last time someone had clung to him like this was shortly after Lady Edelgard had emerged from the dungeons, all those years ago. It was after they were away from the prying eyes of Arundel and that loathsome former Marquis. The young girl, with hair leached of color and eyes brimming with unspeakable nightmare, had latched onto Hubert and wept. Lady Edelgard must have sensed his uneasiness, because she had not sought him out for comforting embraces since that day. Like then, Hubert's body turned into a wooden plank, his mind scrambling for consoling words, commands to issue his body that would force his limbs into gestures that would comfort his heartbroken companion. Hesitantly, Hubert lifted one arm, then the other, and wrapped them around the trembling paladin. Ferdinand tightened his grip in response, nuzzling into Hubert's chest. A patch of dampness spread across Hubert's tunic, from where Ferdinand pressed his face. "Ferdinand?" Hubert ventured again, his voice softer this time. He rubbed a soothing circle across Ferdinand's back. The paladin shuddered and wept into the mage's arms for a moment, before speaking, in a cracked voice. "The healers, they say her condition has taken a turn for the worse, that she may only have a matter of months left. I had to see her before we departed for Fargus, in case it was the last. If she were to pass while I was away at war, I do not know. I do not—" Ferdinand's broken words trailed off into more heaving sobs. Hubert could feel his own heart ripping at his companion's anguish. He leaned into Ferdinand, returning the paladin's hung with matching ardor. One of Hubert's hands moved to cup the back of Ferdinand's head, threading his fingers through the copper hair in what Hubert hoped was a soothing caress. "I am so sorry, Ferdinand," Hubert whispered, resting his chin on Ferdinand's head and pulling the other man close. "If there is anything I can do to help, you need only name it." Ferdinand kept his face tucked against Hubert, his brittle words rattled and punctuated with sniffles. "The thought of her passing alone in that place, I—" "Ferdinand, if you need to take a leave of absence from your military duties to care for your mother, I assure you that can be arranged," Hubert stated, as he clung to the trembling man. "No!" Hubert's eyes widened, taken aback by the fervor of the other man's refusal. Ferdinand pulled his head away from Hubert, stared at him with reddening eyes. Thick rivets of tears rolled down his cheeks, but his face was set with firm determination. "I have a duty to fulfill. We are at the final push of the war. You, Edelgard, and everyone else will need all the help you can get as you march into Fargus. Besides, my mother has made it quite clear to me that she does not want me abandoning my companions for her sake during such a crucial moment." Hubert sighed and nodded. "If that is what you wish, I will not press the matter further, but if you change your mind, I will ensure arrangements for your leave are made." He brushed a strand of tangled copper hair behind Ferdinand's ear as he spoke. Hubert's heart skidded to a halt, his fingers frozen mid-air once he realized what he had done. An apology was already thrumming on the tip of his tongue, but Ferdinand continued, without commenting on the gesture. "Thank you," Ferdinand sniffled. Another sob bubbled in his throat, and he buried his teary face into his hands. I apologize. This is most undignified of me. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." "You have nothing to apologize for," Hubert said firmly, as he pulled the paladin back into an embrace. "I can only imagine the amount of heartbreak you must be going through. I do not know Lady Penelope well, but everything I have heard about her has been immensely positive. A kind, compassionate soul who always puts the well-being of others first and dreams of a brighter future for Fodland. I believe the two of you have much in common." Ferdinand hummed and sniffled at the comment. Gently, he untangled himself from the embrace. "Thank you, Hubert." Ferdinand smiled, despite the tears still sliding down his face. "I know you did not come to Baramas for me, but I thank you for taking time to check in on my well-being, and for waiting for me just now. I know you must be very busy with your own duties." "It is no trouble at all," Hubert said with a small smile, both of his hands resting on the paladin's shoulders, his thumbs tracing small circles across Ferdinand's light tunic. "Speaking of mothers, how is yours, Lady Eileen, if I'm not mistaken?" Ferdinand asked between sniffles. "I have not heard word of her or any members of your family since your father's passing, though I suppose Hasvestra has always been rather secretive." Hubert was tempted to brush away the inquiry, as he often did when anyone asked if he had any living family members, redirect the topic, or provide a cryptic response that offered more questions than answers. The elaborate diversion died in Hubert's mind the second it had formed. Ferdinand deserved more than a garish tapestry of obfuscating lies. "She is well," Hubert said simply, "as are my siblings. They are currently in hiding for their own safety, hence their absence from Adrestian society these past 5 years." Ferdinand blinked, surprised to hear of the discreet living arrangements of Hubert's family, but did not press for further details containing their whereabouts and reasoning for remaining hidden. "When was the last time you saw them?" Ferdinand sniffled, wiping away another stray tear from his cheek. Hubert shifted uncomfortably and winced at the question. "It was when I helped them move during their relocation shortly following my father's death. So, a little over 5 years ago." "Over 5 years? Hubert!" Ferdinand scolded, his brows knitted together, and his eyes blazed like small embers. "That is far too long! You are a general in the Imperial Army, and we are at war! Anything could happen! It is for their own safety that I have maintained my distance," Hubert explained. "My position as the head of the Empire's spy network has awarded me numerous enemies, many of which who would not hesitate to target those I care about in order as a means of harming me." Ferdinand, his face crinkled with concern, took a half-step forward and placed a hand on Hubert's arm. "Hubert, please go see them, while you still have the chance. It will not be long before we are diving into the heart of enemy territory. There is no saying what may happen when we march in the heart of Fargus." Hubert grimaced, his eyes drifting away from the amber stare that bore into him. "I will give thought to your suggestion," Hubert said, even though he already knew what his decision would be. The mention of his family, however, did spark an idea in Hubert's mind. "Ferdinand, I have a proposal," Hubert began. "Your mother and mine are old friends who are still in correspondence with one another. Furthermore, my mother is quite skilled in healing magic. With your permission, I can have Lady Penelope relocated to where my own family is hiding. She will be well protected, and any medical aid that she is currently receiving at the sanatorium can likely be provided by my mother. That way, should the worst come to pass, she will not be alone." Ferdinand's eyes went wide. He blinked rapidly, staving off a fresh wave of pooling tears. "Will that not put your own family at risk? You said they were in hiding for their own protection." "So long as the arrangements are made discreetly, transferring Lady Penelope to my mother's care should be of little difficulty," Hubert stated, Some time will be needed for preparations. You should speak to your mother about the proposal, and I will contact my own mother immediately as well. Everything should be in order before we begin marching on Fargus." Ferdinand's countenance instantly morphed into one of unmasked joy. He swept Hubert up in a tight hug, lifting the mage off his feet, and twirling him around in a small circle. Hubert yelped at the sudden movement, and clung to Ferdinand the second he found himself airborne. Once the mage had been safely returned to the ground, Ferdinand threw himself at Hubert once again, and wrapped his arms around the mage. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," Ferdinand repeated in a mantra that was muffled by Hubert's shoulder. Tears flowed from his eyes once more, but they shined with happiness rather than helpless grief. Ferdinand pulled away from the hug, nearly vibrating with excitement. "I will go ask her right away, though it may take some time to collect her things and speak with the healers as to what medicine she will need. If you do not mind," Ferdinand's voice trailed off with a sheepish lilt, "I will remain here in Baramus until you return. Take as much time as you need." Hubert smiled, resting a hand on Ferdinand's shoulder. "Thank you, Hubert." Ferdinand grinned, and hugged the dark mage once more. "Words cannot describe the depths of my gratitude. I shall return shortly." Hubert chuckled to himself, and shook his head as he watched Ferdinand dash back into the sanatorium. Immediately, his mind spun with plans on how to best conduct the patient transfer. Hubert had debating sending one of his most trusted agents to set up arrangements, but quickly squashed the idea. It would be best if the proposal came from Hubert's own mouth. He had no doubt that his mother would instantly agree to the plan. It would just be a matter of organizing logistics for transporting Lady Penelope to the Vestra cottage in Hrym territory. The detour to Hrym would not take long, and Hubert felt better handling the matter personally. Besides, Ferdinand had been right. He owed his family a visit. Hubert cringed as he thought of the inevitable scolding he was sure to receive from his mother the moment he pops up on the doorstep of their family cottage after not showing his face for more than 5 years. While waiting for Ferdinand, Hubert drifted back to Baramis's marketplace and its many vendors. It would likely be some time before Ferdinand returned. Hubert took the opportunity to properly examine the wide variety of wares offered by the vast array of merchants. Silks, baked goods, produce, jewelry, spices, and much more graced the tables of the electric gathering of vendors. Hubert's eyes lingered over some items that his family members would likely be partial to. Perhaps some gifts would soften the blow of his unexpected and long overdue arrival. As Hubert examined the merchant's table, a loud whisper beckoned to him from one of the nearby buildings. "Psst! Psst! Hubert! Over here!" He turned to see Sylvain, hiding at the edge of an alley. A dark cloak was haphazardly draped over the knight, in a way that did little to hide the full paladin armor beneath. A child's attempt at a disguise. The way he pulled the hood over his face, peeking out the sides of the fabric at those passing by, only succeeded in making him appear more suspicious. He waved frantically at the mage, gesturing to meet in the alley. At the sight of the imbecile that had landed Hubert in this mess to begin with, a sharp flare of annoyance flickered across his face, ready to ignite into rage at a given second. Scowling, Hubert marched towards the disguised paladin, kicking up clouds of dust with each stomp of his boots. The paladin looked like a cake that had been left out in the sun for too long. Sylvain's face was flushed the shade of a tomato, and much of his nose and cheeks were already baked red from sunburn. Sweat-drenched clumps of crimson hair were plastered against his forehead, as more droplets of perspiration dribbled down his face in slick trails. He leaned heavily against the stone wall behind him, gasping as if he had run all the way to Ayr on foot. "Sylvain, fancy meeting you here." Hubert's smile was all teeth, his words carved of venom, forced civility. "And what brings you here to the sparkling waters of Baramus? Hoping to partake in the region's many beaches, or enjoy an afternoon of the radiant sunshine that southeastern Adrestia is well known for?" Hubert sneered, gesturing to the paladin who was panting heavily and clearly melting in the intense heat. Sylvain waved a hand in front of his own face in a futile attempt to fan a cooling breeze at himself. "Yeah, no thanks. This place is hot as balls." Sylvain huffed. As if to emphasize the point, he wiped the beads of sweat that were slithering down his forehead. I don't know how you Adrastians can stand all this heat. That's not the point. So, Sylvain continued after a moment's pause, did you see her? What's she like? Hubert's snarled grin grew near feral. Yes, Sylvain, I did. In fact, I not only saw her, but I actually met the lovely woman Ferdinand was visiting here in Baramis. His ailing mother. Multiple emotions fluttered across Sylvain's face nearly simultaneously, beginning with wide-eyed gaping, before shifting to guilt, then finally deflating into apologetic sorrow. Oh, shit, Sylvain muttered, his shoulders slumping and eyes downcast, giving him the countenance of a kicked puppy. Well, now I really feel like a jackass. As tempting as it is to place all the blame on you, I fear my own reaction did little to de-escalate this misunderstanding. Hubert sighed. Had I taken even a moment to properly look into the matter, I could have easily discovered the identity of Ferdinand's pen pal without embarrassing myself in such a disgraceful manner. The two stood silently for a moment, Hubert quietly fuming, and Sylvain acting as if his own feat were the most interesting sight he had ever encountered. So, how is she? Ferdinand's mom? Sylvain asked, his words hesitant, and his eyes downcast. Hubert winced. His own head hung in a somber reflection of Sylvain's expression. The prognosis for Lady Penelope is not favorable. The healers suspect she may only have months to live. Ferdinand wanted to visit her before we marched into the kingdom, should the worst happen while he is away at war. Damn, Sylvain breathed, his shoulders drooping. How's Ferdinand doing? To most, he will likely maintain his usual sunny disposition to alleviate worry. Hubert sighed. However, it is clear his mother's deteriorating health weighs on him heavily. Poor guy. Guess I really made a mess of things, huh? I will not lie, your subpar intel placed me in an awkward position, even if I was not entirely blameless during this debacle. Though I suppose, Hubert sighed, upon watching Sylvain's increasingly forlorn expression, your blundering idiocy did have a positive outcome in the end. Ferdinand would likely never have disclosed his mother's deteriorating health, nor the distress that the thought of losing a loved one had caused him, had I not stumbled upon he and his mother at the sanatorium. Furthermore, we were able to come to a favorable arrangement that would have Lady Penelope well taken care of and help put Ferdinand's mind at ease. Though, that begs the question, why are you here? Hubert crossed his arms, his face twisted into a sharp scowl. Well, if things went downhill, I thought you could use some company, Sylvain explained with a sheepish laugh as he scratched the back of his head. You know, as a drinking buddy or a shoulder to cry on, or both. Hubert stared at Sylvain with a flat look that made the other man flinch and smile nervously. Whatever words Hubert had been preparing to retort with died in his throat as a familiar figure flared in his peripheral vision and rang a chorus of alarm bells in his mind. It was instinct, more than logic, that alerted him to the presence of the nearby threat, a primal feeling that made his hair rise on end and ice pour into his chest. The source of Hubert's distress did not look conspicuous in the slightest, just another customer among the many who crowded Baramis's market. To an average onlooker, the suspicious man would look nothing more than a regular market-goer, perhaps one of modest wealth, based on the quality of the colorful robes he was garbed in. Several more individuals were dressed in similar attire, and were clearly acquainted with the man. Even from a distance, Hubert could see the way they whispered amongst one another. But the posture, the glimpses of the man's features that could be seen beneath the wide-brimmed hat that dipped across much of his face, they elicited a sickening sense of familiarity that Hubert had come to associate with the dark creatures that puppeted Fodland from the shadows. Hubert grabbed Sylvain by the arm and dragged him deeper into the alley. "Hey, what give—" "Shh!" Hubert hissed, and raised a finger to his mouth, further emphasizing their need for silence. He pulled Sylvain behind a stack of crates. Concealed by the crate shadows, Hubert poked his head around the side and narrowed his eyes at the man in the marketplace, What's going on? What do you see? Quiet! Hubert hissed at the knight once more. Although not garbed in his usual dark mage attire, the man's smug face was recognizable as always. It was a sneer Hubert had encountered multiple times when forced to cooperate with the Empire's most insidious of allies. Mycen, Arundel's Thalas's second in command. Those who slither in the dark were in Baramas.